Okay, let's take a moment. The prophet Isaiah, chapter 41, verses 8 through 13. This is the New Revised Standard Version. But you, Israel, my servant, Jacob, whom I have chosen, the offspring of Abraham, my friend, you, whom I took from the ends of the earth and called from its farthest corner, saying to you, you are my servant. I have chosen you and not cast you off. Do not fear, for I am with you. Do not be afraid, for I am your God. I will strengthen you, help you. I will uphold your victorious right hand. Yes, all who are incensed against you shall be ashamed and disgraced. Those who strive against you shall be as nothing and shall perish. You shall seek those who contend with you, but you shall not find them. Those who war against you shall be as nothing at all. For I, the Lord your God, hold your right hand. It is I who say to you, do not fear. I will help you. These are the words spoken from the prophet Isaiah. Thanks be to God. So as we heard the words from the prophet Isaiah, I'm going to give you a little bit of prophet quiz. What prophet of God spoke these words from the Message version? Was it Haggai from last week? Is it another Isaiah text, Jeremiah? Or does it possibly come from the apostles or Paul or Peter? Let us listen to these words. The judgment of God is on us. If we do not recapture the sacrificial spirit, God's people will lose their authenticity. They will forfeit the loyalty of millions and be dismissed as irrelevant. Hear these words again. The judgment of God is on us. If we do not recapture the sacrificial spirit, God's people will lose their authenticity, forfeit the loyalty of millions, and be dismissed as irrelevant. Anyone know that prophet? Well, I am someone who believes deeply that God is still at work and that God still sends prophets into our midst. Do not always want to hear. And these prophetic words come from the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King in his letter from the Birmingham jail. And if you got your worship email this week, you will see there is a link to the entire letter from the Birmingham jail, which I encourage everyone to read yearly and faithfully. While the canon of the biblical text became closed 500 years ago, if it had remained opened and they had asked my opinion, which I'm sure they would, but if they had asked my opinion, I would definitely add this letter to God's continuous prophetic presence among us. Now today's hymn, Precious Lord, Take My Hand, was often sang or sung by Mahalia Jackson at many of Dr. King's speeches. The hymn was written by Thomas Dorsey when his hand reached out to God's comfort after the loss of his first wife and first child during childbirth. So once again, we have music that comes from the deepest parts of one's pain, suffering, and yearning for God. Another moment when one has no other option but to reach out one's hand to God. And it was then a song that became a part of the civil rights movement, which is a movement that still continues today, and it is a movement that expresses pain, suffering, and yearning for all of us to be noticed, embraced, and recognized as God's beloved. And to actually reach out one's hand in the middle of deep emotional distress is one of the most humbling experiences a person. It takes a type of strength to ask for help when a person feels attacked, persecuted, empty, and weakened. It is something that must be done, this movement, this ask, with a sacrificial spirit and a security and knowledge that God is and remains relevant. This action, placing my hand and asking it to be taken, is powerful. And in it, as I watched myself do it and get ready for this sermon, it of course created questions for me. I mean, the assumption based on some of the history of the song is that the hand reaching out would be empty, a type of void. But I began to wonder, as I like to do, is there something in the hand that needs to be handed over and given away to God? What would God find in your hand? Would it be something we want to give God, or something that may embarrass us? While most of us want God to take our hand and be actively a part of our lives, to truly be in that type of vulnerable space is not comfortable. And yet the moment you feel too comfortable in your faith journey, you are probably not doing what God needs and wants you to be doing. And since we are currently in an uncomfortable time, it seems for everyone, time to reach out your hand. A few weeks ago, some of you remember that I preached on my friend Chastity. Now, at the end of that sermon, I shared with you that she had only been born with one arm and one leg, which also means she only had one hand. Now, during her service, a longtime colleague of mine and good friend of Chas was asked to share the message. I will tell you that it was the best faith-based eulogy I have ever heard. Compliment that friend too much. Let's take a little bit of time to share about the personality of this colleague of mine, because this colleague has personality. He is fun. He is the type of pastor that often older people find super frustrating, youth and young people love, and parents are relieved their kids want to go to church, but they're not ever sure if they're actually learning anything about God. And even though he is now older, I am sure that he still breaks quite a few rules and attempts to constantly play the cool card. It sometimes takes a lot to break into the real, authentic person under all of that energy. He makes me look really low-key. So one of the things that he talked about that many of us will continue to miss about Chastity is that she could break your facade and do it quickly. She may only have one hand, but she reached out with it in a way that connected you to sacred and authentic God moments. And while many of us would first meet her and think she needed us because we have more hands, she would often quickly remind us that we were not using our two hands as much as we should to change the world. My colleague shared that Chastity, as a teenager, called his bluff. She basically told him he was all talk. She could see that while he acted relevant, She didn't actually believe that he was always authentic. So during a trip, she told him and asked him and challenged him to touch the stump where her possession. She made him reach out his hand and experience a sacrificial moment. Reach out a hand and face some of the greatest weaknesses and possibly truly find your greatest strength. Reach out a hand and know that you may find God where you least expect it, and reach out a hand and face the reality you did not want to face. Shared that he finally, after much coaxing, reached out his hand, touched her stump, and left, broken, bawling, and needing an authentic God to truly help him stand in this new sacrificial type space. You see, God wants and will take our hand. But are we ready to grab on and receive what God is going to give to us when we let go of other things? Because if we reach our hand out, at some point we will pull it back, and we will have to look to see what God may have placed there. If we think of it like the parable of the sower that we heard today during our worship and wonder time, you can think of it as seeds left in your hand. What are we being called then to grow? And how are we going to plant these seeds and care for them and work with them and nurture them thrive? These seeds plant in different places and ways, even in ourselves and in others. And how do we keep them relevant and authentic and sacred, and determine if they will be able to grow to experience what it means to really be in relationship with God and know God's authentic love? If you think about Martin Luther King and Mahalia Jackson and many others like John Lewis and Reverend C.T. Vivian, they used today's hymn as a way to nurture and grow and faithfully respond their lives directly to one of the most rampant sins in our world, the ongoing sin of racism. And so they planted seeds, and some of them thrived, and some are now just growing, and some still fell on weeds and are being strangled, and others are fighting their way through rocks that are trying to smother them. Are we gathering the seeds that God is giving to us and actually openly and willing and with energy planting them? Are we continuing to be authentic, prophetic voices that remind the world that our faith, our God, and our knowledge of Jesus is relevant, real, and filled with sacrificial spirit? Are we truly trusting God's victorious hand in the midst of many who try to silence our faith, our God, and our knowledge that only God can truly strengthen us? When we structures, even sometimes our own churches and institutions, who are seemingly sometimes adverse to allowing people to really experience God's love, are we humbling ourselves, echoing to God that we are hurting, we are empty, and we are crying out for all of God's lost children? A few years ago, I was humbled to walk across the Edmund Pettus Bridge with many of our denominational Black leaders. It was a faith moment and experience. Thus, today's message will end with another prophetic voice. And may all the words of the different prophets that God has sent us continue to help us reach out our hands in ways that we are able to help ourselves and others and the world to know how to stand for God. John Lewis says, the civil rights movement was based on faith. Many of us who were participants in this movement saw our involvement as an extension of our faith. We saw ourselves doing the work of the Almighty, Segregation and racial discrimination were not in keeping with our faith, so we had to do something. Whatever your faith is being called you to do, whatever movements your heart to help God's people is being called to action, may you take out your hand and step towards doing something that is relevant, authentic, and sacrificial, knowing that with this action, God is strengthening you for those times. Amen.